The Cleveland Browns didn't just fire a head coach. They erased the last excuse this franchise has been hiding behind for years. When Kevin Stefanski was let go, it wasn't just another coaching change, it was an admission. An admission that 6 seasons of buzzwords, patience speeches, and trust the system talk led nowhere. 8 wins in 2 years, a stalled offense, a locker room drifting, and in the middle of it all, a rookie quarterback forced to survive chaos instead of being developed. That quarterback was Shedeur Sanders. All season long, fans were told the same story. He needed time, he needed to earn trust. The system mattered more than instincts. Mistakes would be punished, growth would come later. But what nobody wanted to say out loud was this: Shedeur was never coached like a franchise quarterback in the first place. He wasn't empowered, he wasn't unleashed. He was managed, restricted, asked to play safe football inside an offense that was already falling apart. And that's not development, that's survival mode. Survival mode is where careers stall if organizations get it wrong. And now, they can't hide anymore. The moment Stefanski was fired, the narrative flipped overnight. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether Shedeur failed the Browns. It was whether the Browns failed Shedeur. Because despite the tight leash, despite the collapsing pockets, despite the mixed messaging from the sideline, the rookie still flashed real NFL traits: calm under pressure, poise late in games, leadership when everything else broke down. Now the shield is gone. No more system excuses, no more conservative philosophy dressed up as patience. The spotlight is finally where it belongs, on the organization itself. And for the first time since Shedeur arrived in Cleveland, the Browns are forced to answer a question they spent an entire season avoiding. Was the problem ever the quarterback? Or was it everything around him? Because how they answer that will define what comes next for the Cleveland Browns and for Shedeur Sanders. For 6 straight seasons, the Cleveland Browns leaned on one familiar shield: patience. Whenever things went wrong, the explanation was always the same. The system needs time. The quarterback needs structure. The process just hasn't fully matured yet. And standing at the center of that narrative was Kevin Stefanski, marketed as the stabilizer, the adult in the room, the coach who would finally bring order to chaos. But that shield just collapsed. When ownership publicly admitted that winning 8 games in 2 years was totally unacceptable, it wasn't just frustration, it was accountability. For the first time in a long time, the Browns stopped blaming circumstance and started acknowledging failure. And that moment matters because it removes the last layer of protection from how this season has been explained. The truth is, the Browns weren't progressing, they were stagnant. The offense didn't evolve, the messaging stayed conflicted. One week emphasized aggression, the next punished it. And in the middle of that confusion was a rookie quarterback trying to survive rather than grow. That's not how development works in this league. Development requires clarity, trust, repetition. Instead, what existed was hesitation on the sideline and on the field. This is why the firing changed the conversation overnight. Once Stefanski was gone, the questions stopped being about system fit and started being about organizational responsibility. Because if the coach is removed, the blame can't be deflected anymore. The front office, the philosophy, the decision-making, all of it comes into focus. And that's where Shedeur Sanders re-enters the discussion differently. All season, critics framed his performance as proof he wasn't ready. But readiness doesn't exist in a vacuum. Quarterbacks don't develop through restriction. They don't grow while playing scared. They don't unlock instincts when every mistake tightens the leash. What Cleveland called patience often looked like fear of letting the rookie actually be himself. That's the part fans are only starting to process now. With the shield gone, it's harder to argue that Shedeur failed to meet expectations when the expectations were never clearly defined. It's harder to claim development when empowerment never happened. And it's harder to pretend the system was working when the organization itself admitted it was. So now the Browns are left with something they've avoided for years: an honest evaluation. Not just of the quarterback, but of how they've handled him. Because once excuses disappear, Accountability doesn't just land on one player. It lands on everyone who shaped the environment around him. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable because it forces a rewatch of the season with a different lens. Not through stats, not through box scores, but through intent. Because when you look closely, Shedeur Sanders was never treated like the future of the franchise. He was treated like a liability that needed to be managed. From the very beginning, the leash was tight. Play calling shrank after mistakes instead of expanding with confidence. One interception would be followed by ultra-conservative sequences. Aggression was preached in press conferences, then quietly punished on Sundays. That mixed messaging does more damage to a young quarterback than any bad throw ever could. This wasn't about learning on the fly. It was about earning trust snap by snap and losing it just as fast. A franchise quarterback is coached through mistakes. His errors are teaching moments, not red lights. He's allowed to react, to play instinctively, to build rhythm. But with Shedeur, you could see the opposite happening. The hesitation crept in, not because he couldn't read the field, but because he was thinking about consequences instead of opportunities. That's a dangerous place for a quarterback to live. And it showed up in subtle ways. Feet getting slightly jumpy in clean pockets, double-clutching throws he'd normally rip, waiting a half-second longer to confirm what he already knew. Not fear, caution. The kind that comes from knowing one wrong decision could pull the rug out from under you. This is where Kevin Stefanski deserves real scrutiny. Stefanski understands offense. That's not up for debate. But understanding offense and understanding quarterback psychology are not the same thing. What works for veterans doesn't work for rookies. What feels safe for a coach often feels suffocating to a young quarterback trying to establish himself. And the result was a quarterback playing tight inside an offense that was already collapsing. That's not development, that's containment. Yet even inside that constraint, Shedeur still flashed, which is the most telling part of all. When the pocket collapsed and instincts took over, you could see what was being held back. The arm talent, the composure, the ability to make something out of nothing. Those moments didn't come because of the system. They came in spite of it. Which leads to the most uncomfortable realization of all. If this is what Shedeur looked like while being restricted, what happens when he's finally trusted? Because once you start asking that question honestly, the entire evaluation changes. This is where the narrative starts to crack, because no matter how tightly a quarterback is managed, real ability always leaks through. And with Shedeur Sanders, it showed up in moments the box score could never explain. Go back to the late game situations, 3rd and long, protection breaking down almost immediately, receivers struggling to separate. These weren't clean, scripted situations designed to make a rookie look comfortable. These were survival snaps, and in those moments, Shedeur didn't look overwhelmed, he looked composed. That distinction matters. There were throws that jumped off the screen, tight window lasers delivered with defenders closing fast, touch passes dropped in where only his receiver could make a play, subtle pocket movement that bought just enough time for a route to develop. These weren't lucky completions or blown coverages. These were NFL-level reads and throws happening under stress. And stress exposes everything. What stood out wasn't just the arm talent, it was the calm. When the pocket collapsed, he didn't panic. He didn't bail early or force reckless throws. He kept his eyes downfield. He trusted his mechanics. That's not something you teach easily, that's wiring. Yet those moments were often brushed aside. Critics focused on the interceptions without acknowledging context. They pointed to raw numbers without asking why the offense stalled. They ignored the fact that many of his best plays came when the structure completely failed. In other words, when the system disappeared, the quarterback showed up. That should have raised alarms in a good way. Because if a rookie can function when everything breaks down, that's usually a sign of upside, not limitation. Most young quarterbacks crumble in those moments. They speed up, they lose mechanics, they start guessing. Shedeur didn't. He stayed within himself even when the game around him was falling apart. And this is why the firing changed the entire conversation. Once Cleveland Browns removed the head coach, those flashes couldn't be dismissed as system noise anymore. They became evidence. Evidence that the quarterback wasn't failing, he was surviving long enough to show what he could be. That's the part people don't want to admit. Because it's easier to label a rookie not ready than to admit the environment wasn't ready for him. It's easier to point at numbers than to explain why instincts were being suppressed. But when you isolate the moments where Shedeur was forced to rely on himself, the picture gets clearer. Those flashes weren't accidents. They were glimpses. And once you see them for what they are, the question isn't whether he belongs. It's how much more is there once the restraints are finally removed. The moment Kevin Stefanski was let go, the entire evaluation of this season flipped. Not slowly, instantly, because once the head coach is gone, the organization loses its favorite fallback. No more system fit, no more long-term vision, no more hiding behind philosophy. What's left is the raw question everyone avoided all year: who actually failed here? And that question lands uncomfortably close to the building. For months, the Browns framed every rough stretch as part of a bigger plan. The rookie needed structure, the offense needed time. The process was working even when the results said otherwise. But firing the head coach is a confession. It says the process wasn't working. It says the structure wasn't right. And it says the environment may have been the problem all along. That's why Shedeur's season looks different now. When a coach stays, struggles get pinned on players. When a coach goes, the lens widens. Suddenly, the restrictive play calling isn't discipline, it's fear. The shortened leash isn't accountability, it's mistrust. And the hesitation that crept into the quarterback's game isn't immaturity, it's a response to mixed messaging. This is the inflection point. Because once you accept that the system failed, you're forced to reevaluate the quarterback inside it. Not as a finished product, but as someone navigating instability. Someone trying to do the right thing while the ground kept shifting beneath him. That's why the firing didn't just reset the coaching search, it reset the quarterback conversation. Now every decision becomes louder. Who picks the next head coach? What traits matter? Do they want control or collaboration? Most importantly, do they bring in someone who believes in empowering a young quarterback, or someone who wants to manage risk first and ask questions later? This is where franchises reveal who they are. Teams serious about development choose coaches who build around their quarterback's strengths. Teams afraid of failure choose coaches who play not to lose. And the Browns have lived on the wrong side of that divide for years. Which is why this offseason matters more than any draft pick. Because if Cleveland Browns brings in a coach who trusts the quarterback, encourages instincts, and designs an offense to attack instead of survive, the narrative around Shedeur changes fast. But if they hedge again, split reps, manufacture competition, tighten the leash, the story repeats itself. The firing took away the shield. Now the Browns have nowhere to hide. And for the first time since Shedeur arrived, the future won't be defined by philosophy or patience. It will be defined by choice. Here, where the conversation turns from emotion to cold reality. Because once you look ahead to the draft landscape, the Browns don't have the luxury of pretending there's an obvious escape hatch. This upcoming quarterback class simply isn't stacked with slam-dunk answers. There's no clear consensus superstar waiting at the top. No prospect carrying the kind of universal confidence that forces a franchise to reset everything overnight. And that matters because drafting a quarterback isn't just about talent, it's about certainty. If you're going to start over again, you need a reason so strong it overrides everything you already have in the building. Right now, that reason doesn't exist. That's why many around the league believe the most logical path for the Cleveland Browns isn't another hard reset, it's a recalibration. Build instead of replace. Fix the environment before blaming the quarterback. And that puts Shedeur Sanders right back at the center of the plan. This isn't blind loyalty, It's roster math. The Browns have clear needs that impact quarterback play immediately: offensive line depth, a true difference-making wide receiver, more stability up front so the offense doesn't collapse by default. If Cleveland uses premium draft capital to address those areas, they're not guessing, they're giving themselves real information. Because here's the key: you don't actually know what you have in a quarterback until you give him a fair setup. If Shedeur gets a reinforced offensive line, better separation on the outside, and an offensive system that encourages timing and rhythm, the evaluation becomes honest. No more excuses on either side. If he thrives, you've found your guy. If he doesn't, then you move forward with clarity instead of regret. That's why the "just draft another QB" crowd is missing the point. Drafting a quarterback into the same broken structure doesn't solve anything, it just restarts the cycle. Cleveland has lived that loop: draft, struggle, blame, reset for decades. Doing it again without fixing the foundation would be organizational malpractice. There's also the strategic layer. Some believe Cleveland could reassess the quarterback position in a stronger future class if needed. That option only exists if the team stays competitive and functional in the meantime. You don't get long-term flexibility by panicking, you get it by stabilizing. This is the real draft reality check. The Browns don't need a savior, they need answers. And the fastest way to get them isn't another blind gamble, it's finally building around the quarterback they already have and letting the evaluation play out the way it should have from the start. Because if Cleveland gets this wrong again, it won't be because the options weren't there. It'll be because they chose the shortcut instead of the solution. This is where a lot of quarterback debates go wrong, because numbers are easy to quote but hard to understand without context. On paper, Shedeur Sanders didn't post eye-popping stats. The touchdown-to-interception ratio isn't clean. The win-loss record doesn't jump off the page. And for some critics, that's where the analysis stops. But football isn't played on spreadsheets. Stats tell you what happened, they don't tell you why it happened. And when you zoom out, the environment around Shedeur explains far more than the box score ever could. Start with protection. Pressure arrived early and often. Collapsing pockets weren't occasional, they were routine. When a quarterback is forced to speed up his clock every snap, numbers suffer, routes don't fully develop, timing breaks down, and throws that should be rhythm completions turn into contested attempts. Interceptions in those situations aren't always bad decisions, they're symptoms of structural failure. Then there's down on distance. Shedeur consistently faced long-yardage situations where the defense knew exactly what was coming. Third and long behind a struggling offensive line is one of the hardest situations in football. Completion percentages drop, risk increases, and conservative play calling paradoxically puts even more pressure on the quarterback to be perfect. This is where context matters most. Critics love to isolate mistakes without acknowledging the setup. A tipped pass becomes an interception, a late throw becomes a turnover, but rewind the play and you'll often see missed blocks, receivers failing to separate, or routes breaking down entirely. Those details never show up in a stat line, but they define quarterback outcomes. What does show up on film, though, is how a quarterback responds. Despite the chaos, Shedeur didn't spiral. He didn't start forcing reckless throws to pad numbers. He didn't abandon structure entirely. He stayed composed. He protected the ball when he could. And when the situation demanded it, he still took calculated chances to keep drives alive. That's not recklessness, that's management under duress. And here's the uncomfortable comparison. Plenty of quarterbacks around the league have posted cleaner numbers in far safer environments. Clean pockets, defined reads, built-in answers, swap situations, and the numbers would look very different for everyone involved. That's why box score scouting is dangerous. When people point to statistics without context, they're often evaluating the offense, not the quarterback. They're grading the environment as much as the player. And in Cleveland's case, that environment was unstable from top to bottom. So the real question is whether Shedeur's stats were perfect. It's whether those stats accurately reflect his performance. And once you answer that honestly, the conversation shifts from what the numbers say to what the tape has been showing all along. There's one factor that never shows up in draft grades, stat sheets, or debate shows, but inside an NFL building, it matters more than almost anything else: the locker room. And this is where the conversation around Shedeur Sanders becomes impossible for the Browns to dodge. Because despite the instability, despite the coaching tension, despite the constant scrutiny, one thing quietly happened over the course of the season: players rallied around him. Teammates believed in him. That doesn't happen by accident. NFL locker rooms are unforgiving. Veterans don't follow rookies just because they're drafted high or talked about on TV. They follow quarterbacks who show poise when things go wrong, who take accountability without throwing teammates under the bus, who don't panic when the crowd turns restless and the pocket collapses again. That's where Shedeur separated himself. When games slipped away, he didn't sulk. When mistakes happened, he owned them. When questions came, he didn't deflect. No passive-aggressive comments, no excuses, just steady presence. And over time, that consistency builds trust in ways that schemes never can. This is especially important in Cleveland. The Cleveland Browns have a long history of quarterbacks losing the locker room before they ever lost the job. You could see it in body language, in effort dropping, in quiet disengagement. That didn't happen here. Even when the offense struggled, even when wins were scarce, the team never checked out on him. That alone is a warning sign for the front office. Because once a quarterback has the locker room, replacing him becomes more complicated. You're not just changing a depth chart, you're resetting belief. You're asking veterans to buy into another restart, another learning curve, another year of uncertainty. And in a building that's already lived through decades of resets, that's a dangerous ask. This is why the firing raised the stakes. If Cleveland brings in a new head coach who doesn't believe in Shedeur, the friction will be immediate. Not loud, not public, but real, because players can tell when a quarterback is being propped up versus when he's being trusted. And trust is contagious. That's the piece fans don't see from the outside. Shedeur didn't just survive the chaos, he earned respect inside it. And respect is the hardest thing to rebuild once you throw it away. The Browns can draft another quarterback, they can sell another vision. But they can't pretend this part doesn't exist. Because when an organization ignores the locker room eventually ignores the organization. And Cleveland has reached the point where that margin for error is gone. This is the moment the Cleveland Browns can't escape anymore. Not with spin, not with patient speeches, not with another reset disguised as long-term vision. Because everything that happened this season, every mixed message, every stalled drive, every tight-leash decision, has led them right back to the same question they've been dodging for decades. Do you commit or do you repeat history? The firing of Kevin Stefanski didn't just end an era. It stripped the organization bare. No more system excuses. No more philosophical cover. What's left is a young quarterback who survived instability, earned the locker room, and showed real NFL traits in an environment that did him no favors. That quarterback is Shedeur Sanders. And here's the part Cleveland has to be honest about. Shedeur never asked for excuses. He never blamed the scheme. He never pointed fingers when protection failed or play calling tightened. He showed up. He absorbed criticism. He kept his confidence intact in a franchise that's historically shattered quarterbacks mentally. That matters. Because arm talent can be refined, footwork can be cleaned up, decision-making improves with reps. But poise, presence, command under pressure, you either have it or you don't. And Shedeur has already shown he does, without being fully trusted, without being fully unleashed. Now the Browns have a choice they can't delay. They can bring in a head coach who believes in quarterback empowerment, vertical aggression, and building around strengths. A coach who views mistakes as tuition, not disqualifiers. If they do that, Shedeur's second-year leap could be real, the kind that changes how this franchise is viewed across the league. Or they can hedge again. Manufacture competition, shorten the leash, protect him instead of trusting him, and if they choose that path, the outcome won't be a mystery, because Cleveland doesn't ruin quarterbacks by accident. They ruin them by refusing to commit. This offseason isn't about talent evaluation anymore. It's about organizational courage, about whether the Cleveland Browns are finally willing to break the cycle they created, or whether they'll restart it one more time and act surprised when it ends the same way. The scary part for the rest of the league. If Cleveland gets this right, if Shedeur Sanders finally gets a coach who trusts him, this story stops being about survival. It becomes about takeover.